We're going to have a panel of managers right now, and so I'd like to invite up Thad Heater, Raul Morales, Carolyn Sweat, Bill Dunkelberger, and Stiver. And while they're getting set up, let me go ahead and explain how this is going to work. We'll have one speaker at a time who's sitting and standing where I am, and the rest of the panel will remain over at their chairs. They'll each have about 10 minutes for their presentation and also for a Q&A. Each of the speakers was asked to talk about what we've been hearing today with the science framework. So beginning with, how did your agency do business in the past? So prior to having all of this large-scale information and the multi-scale approach information that we've been looking at today, how was your organizational unit or agency doing business? How are those practices changing as a result of this kind of information and these types of products? And what do you plan to do with the science framework as we move forward? So they'll each have about 10 minutes to address that, and that will include a small Q&A. And then at the end, we'll go over to the panelists as a whole. We'll take the microphone over there so that we can keep the camera happy, and we'll have 10 minutes for a Q&A at that time with the entire panel at one point. So with that, I'd like to start by introducing or inviting Thad to come on up, and then we'll do introductions on the rest as they come along. Thad Heater is working as the Sagebrush Science Coordinator for the Natural Resources Conservation Initiative. I just said that wrong. I am so sorry. Let me just read, and that will be easier. I won't muck it up. Sage-Grouse Initiative Coordinator for the Natural Resources Conservation Landscape Initiatives team. So I had all the words. I just jumbled them. Thank you very much, Thad.
Yep. Thank you. It's a privilege to be here and speaking on behalf of my agency and private landowners and their conservation efforts. I grew up on a ranch in Northeast Oregon, so the fire and invasive issue is something that's very real to me and my family and stuff that are still living in Eastern Oregon and throughout the Great Basin. One of the things I want to say, starting out about NRCS, is our agency has a long history of working with private landowners dating clear back to our inception during the Dust Bowl era. During the Dust Bowl, a combination of farming practices and prolific drought really created some serious consequences on the landscape where the soil was blowing clear to Washington, D.C., and hundreds and millions of tons were lost off the landscape. Not to mention, agriculture was badly hurt, so was the U.S. economy. In 1935, Congress realized that this was a serious issue and created the Soil Conservation Service to effectively deal with the conservation issues on the landscape. Now, when the Soil Conservation was established, it was put under U.S. Department of Agriculture, and a gentleman named Hugh Hammond Bennett, who was a big proponent of conservation and warned that the farming practices across the U.S. were going to have a negative consequence, was named our first chief. One of the things that we started out doing as an agency locally was working with local people. There was field offices established in nearly every county across the U.S. And one of the principles that Hugh Hammond Bennett instilled in us was to use science and local information in making our resource identifying our resource concerns and making our conservation recommendations. And we've continued to do that to date. We've continued to learn from past mistakes using science and outcome-based evaluations. And one of the things I want to say is over time, we've continued to get better, and we have always really realized from the inception of our agency the value of partnership. And as we look across the West with what we've got going on with the fire and invasive and other conservation issues, partnership is key. And in 1994, our agency was named and renamed the Soil Conservation Service, to NRCS. My mistake. Think about too many things ahead. That's what happens when you deal with a farm and ranch kid. He gets to thinking about what's going on as he's riding down the road. Anyway, we were given a broader name called the Natural Resources Conservation Service to encompass a broader mission, including soil, water, the air, wildlife, and with that, we really started stepping up our focus on wildlife and everything. But Up until that point, it was more random acts of conservation. There was no real strategy typically in what we did across the country. Fast forward to 2010, when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service made an awarded but precluded announcement for sage grouse, we really realized we needed to step up our game and bring the power of the Farm Bill and tackle this issue, because it was very important to our producers on the landscape, but also our partners. There was 3 things we wanted to do: proactively address conservation at scales that made a difference and use science throughout, dating back clear to our inception of our agency, and enlist the power of our partners to help us do that. One of the things I want to say is we had a big problem to tackle, as everyone else did, and we started out using Lex. Kevin Doherty published his breeding bird density map, and it really helped us identify where we were going to work. We could benefit 500 birds instead of just 5 and everything on the landscape by strategically placing our dollars in the landscape where it have the most benefit. One of the things I want to say is we've continued to learn, our partners have continued to learn, and in 2010 or 2012 and 13, when the working group with Ken Mayer was established for on fire and invasives, we were one of the initial folks there. Jeremy Mestis, who is sitting here in the audience, and our soil staff stepped up and everything to be part of this team effort and everything. And we want to thank, Ken and Gene Chambers for the leadership on that. We as an agency didn't have the tools or the people to really effectively across the landscape deal with fire and invasives. And we really thank everybody for coming together and making that happen. The first, GTR that was published was on the Great Basin, and people said, what about east? And finally that second one came to bear. One of the things with SGI, we've always learned that, what catches on one part of the landscape, people take lessons learned and apply it other places. And I think, the science framework and the team that's really working on it from day one have done an outstanding job on this. And with SGI, one of the key things when we launched it, we wanted to tell the story and tell it better. We wanted to be able to transfer knowledge and everything. And so we have worked with communications and media efforts to make that better. But as we came up with new science with our science advisor, Dave Noggle, working with the other scientists, whether they're agencies or NGOs or university experts and stuff, how do you transfer that? And we developed what we call the SGI web app on the SGI website to transfer the science and the models to the actual practitioners on the landscape. Very key. I mean, you can't just go around handing thumb drives off on these major projects and everything hoping to get it done. And so it's really helped us scale up and everything. One of the things we did when we put that web app on there is we had a layer for conifer. We also put the R&R, the resilience and resistance layers on there and everything to share. And that's one of the key things that's changed for us is sharing that information and actually putting it to use on the landscape. When we did our SGI 2.0 plans and everything in 2015, that was part of our efforts, especially in the Great Basin, was looking at the resistance and resilience. Jeremy Mestis at the West Tech Center and some of the other key folks really helped our states drill into that and everything and take advantage of that science and everything and put it to work. Now it's becoming more ingrained in what we're doing, and it's very subtle. I was talking to Bill Dunkelberger, one of my co-panelists out in the hall just before I came in here, and he goes, well, I started preparing for my talk and talking to my staff, and they said, well, we're using this and that aspect of resistance resilience, and it's very subtle, but it's very important in everything, and I really thank everybody for their involvement in producing these tools. One of the things on the landscape in 2015 that we learned that we can do more together to make a difference, and it adds up. We avoided a listing, but since 2015, we're all still here, we're all still working, and since the inception of SGI, we have now put, just on our end, with our partners, 6.3 million acres on the ground. And that was through voluntary conservation with private landowners. NRCS, as an agency, does not have any regulatory purview. That's ranchers and farmers stepping up and working with us hand in hand. And that, I think, partnerships are key, but this using science to strategically target with limited dollars where we are on the landscape is going to be very key moving forward and everything. So one of the things I want to say, I know we're going to have to do more with less, but us all working together, we'll all continue to make a difference on the landscape. And I'm very enthusiastic thinking about what we have in store of us to tackle, but I think we can make a difference working together. So with that, I'll take a question. however much time I have.
We'll have other people speak and then questions, or questions first?
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Thad. And I really, in particular, when I went and said, will you be the first panelist? He said, well, yes. So thank you very much. I really do appreciate that. I appreciated your comments in particular about partnership and communications. And with that, would really like to thank NRCS and SGI and Jeremy in particular for putting together the broadcast that we have on today. That's why this happened. That and the fact that Hannah stayed up all last night getting our tech problems resolved. So you went on over duty there, and we really appreciate it. And, so thank you for that. Our next panelist will be Raul Morales, who's a Deputy State Director with the Bureau of Land Management here in Reno. I first met him when he was working with wildlife back in Washington, D.C., right as I got there. And I'm excited to hear what he has to say. He's always had an interest and a passion for work in the natural environment, and he really loves the interaction and connection of social challenges associated with natural resource management. And with that, I think the Sagebrush ecosystem is a marvelous place for you to have landed. So thank you, Raul.
Okay, thank you. All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm pleased to be here this afternoon to talk about where the Bureau is heading and where we've been heading over the past few years. I have over 35 years of experience working with the Bureau of Land Management, and I've seen a lot of changes over that 35 years. I'm going to get into some of that here quickly. But just a little background about the Bureau of Land Management. Most of you probably know we're the largest land management agency in the United States. We manage 245 million surface acres as well as 700 million acres of subsurface basically mineral resources. Our mission is to sustain the health and productivity of our landscapes for the current and future use of our publics. And so that means that we're responsible for managing America's public resources containing a variety of resources from energy and minerals development, livestock grazing, recreation, timber harvesting, while at the same time protecting a wide array of natural, cultural, and historic resources for the use and enjoyment of folks for today as well as thinking into the future. In fiscal year 2016, the diverse activities authorized by BLM on its public lands generated $75 billion in economic output throughout the country. I believe we're second to the IRS as far as bringing money back into the Treasury. This economic activity supported 372,000 jobs and also contributed substantial revenue to the U.S. Treasury and state governments, and primarily most of our revenue comes from our mineral and oil and gas resources. BLM works with partners to promote multiple use on those lands and through shared conservation stewardship and to facilitate opportunities for energy development that create jobs, help support communities, and establish America's energy dominance. We all need good science at the end of the day and spatial information and a deep local understanding of the landscapes if we are going to be successful in putting our projects in the least conflict areas and doing restoration in areas that are going to achieve their greatest success. So with that background of what we do in BLM, I want to go into kind of the spatial scales that we've been operating under in the past and where we're headed in the future, and then give a few examples of how we're making that transition. So historically, BLM has worked at the national, state, and local scales. We are structured on a statewide approach. We're not a regional organization like Forest Service or Fish and Wildlife Service. Our boundaries are the statewide boundaries. And within each one of our states, we have field units, which we call our district offices or field units. And so a lot of our experience operating, over the much of my career has been definitely at that field office level landscape or that district office level landscape. Over the past few years, and as a result, we've been hearing a lot about sage grouse and threats to the sagebrush ecosystem. We have shifted towards a regional approach as far as how we look at our landscapes and how we do our work. This has been a huge cultural change in the organization because now we really have to look across field office district boundaries or state office boundaries. And so, needless to say, we're still in that process right now. We're still working through that. But I'll go over an example here of where I think we're starting to make some success. In the Great Basin ecoregion, we've divided ourselves into two regions, an eastern region, or Rocky Mountain region, composing the states of Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and northeastern Utah. And then we have a western region, including the Columbia Basin, which has the Great Basin states, the western part of Utah, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, a little bit of northeast California, and Nevada. And the purpose of that is for us to start to begin how we're going to start planning our projects. It also helps when we get our funding from Washington office, how we're going to spend that money strategically within these regions. The science framework that we've been hearing a lot about here today contains a catalog of data that, by the way, is available to the public through the landscape portal. What do we call it? The Landscape Approach Data Portal, which I looked at on the Nevada BLM website, or the BLM website, and definitely you can access it and find all the data that we've been talking about. So in these regions, we're starting to mine that data in order to determine, with the limited funds that we get as an agency, if we had $1, where is the best place to put that $1 in the landscape? And so with that kind of attitude, this science framework and the information that's in there is helping us determine where are we going to go. We just saw a picture of the horses and the resistance and resilience. 5 minutes already. Okay, and where do we know, where should we go? Maybe where should we avoid if we're going to be strategic in our dollars? So I think with this science framework, what's really helpful and exciting about that is when we have a new need, when we're looking at some new projects, we have the ability to go to the framework, get the data, and the data is going to be relatively safe data as far as relatively vetted data, and it's going to be consistent. So if I have an employee that's working in Elko or someone that's working in Vernal, Utah, we're looking at the same data, and that helps us be consistent as an agency, more consistent in agency when we're doing our NEPA work, and also helps when our project proponents or stakeholders are dealing with us, because we're looking at the same information and giving the same information, and they're not wondering when they go to one office why they hear one thing and go to another office they hear another thing. So this is part of the transition that we're moving into from the way we've done business in the past. So as far as the science framework, and two of the big tools that we have been using, and you probably heard a little bit about this, but the FIAT, Fire and Invasive Assessment Tool, which is pretty much in the Great Basin states, which addresses kind of the primary threats we were dealing with on the sagebrush ecosystems of fire and invasive species. And then what we have is a SMART tool in the eastern region, which stands for Sagebrush Management Assessment Resilience and Resistance and Resilience Tool, SMART. That's a tough one. But again, it deals with the impacts and the threats over there on the sagebrush ecosystem, which is a lot of the habitat, the development that you see on the landscape, and we saw a slide of that, of some of the oil and gas development on the landscape. So we divided it into two regions because the threats were different in the two regions, and the FIAT tool and the SMART tool, big part of the science framework, really are use the latest science to help us address those issues at that level. So just a few examples. Here in the Great Basin side, which I've been heavily involved with, we've been refining where we're going to go and where we're going to put our money. And we, being all the five, what we call the 5 great western states, and the leadership have been getting together over the past 2 years to talk about breaking down those state line boundaries, and let's go where we need to go. Where do we need to put these dollars if we only have X amount? Where are we going to get the best bang for the buck? And over the past 2 years, information in the FIAT, information on the spatial components that we're starting to get into. We've created what we call an IPAL, Integrated Program of Work, on the Great Basin side. So we're using all of this data to help us refine where we want to go and where we're going to put the dollars. And in the Great Basin states, the money we get from our Washington office, we've agreed that 75% of those funds are going to go towards this IPAL effort, to put the money where it belongs. But we also recognize locally there are some states, high priority things that our state directors in each one of our states might be working with governor's staff or other partners where that project may not elevate real high in the ranking under this IPAL system, but it's one that's probably needs a little bit of attention at the local level. So the 25% is to address those local needs at the state level. So you know, the models and the data that we're gleaning from that is really going to help us in our fiscal year 19 projects and out. Fiscal year 18, what we're currently in, didn't quite have all the information, but it was definitely a phase that we worked through on the science framework to get to where we're at, and I think where everyone is comfortable with how we're going to be doing business in the future. We'll definitely be working at local scales once we push this information down, so that our field office units can be working with the local partners, whether it's our Fish and Game agencies, Department of Ag, NGOs, to really, you know, then take that information and fine tune it to meet the local needs. Example number 2, real quickly, we're in the very early stages of this. We're using the resistance and resilience concepts to kind of arrive at a more defensible, site-appropriated ESR. Basically our fire. After we do a burn, then we go in and we plant the area. And so we're trying to come up with, can we use the resistance and resilience model to figure out, again, with the dollars we have there, how can we ensure recovery at the best, you know, the best way possible. And we're in the real early stages of that one. Another very diverse management opportunity that we're looking at is the use of biopesticides, testing biopesticides on the landscape. Again, using the R&R model. And applying those concepts onto the pesticides. The early prognosis of that is that in those medium ranges of the R&R is where we think biopesticides are going to give us the best success, but again, preliminary information. So we're using it you're looking at it from a sage-grouse habitat, sagebrush ecosystem approach. We're looking at biopesticides. We're looking at emergency stabilization and rehabilitation efforts to do that. So in summary, real quick, products like the science framework help us prioritize our work, where to match our management activities with site condition and choose the best tools for the job. The science framework provides a decision-making framework for designing treatments and management strategies across ecological gradients and across the entire sagebrush ecosystem. The framework provides the information of value to many program areas like fuels, like I mentioned, management, fire operations, wildlife range. Each scale, whether we're operating at the national, regional, state, or field levels, needs this information, needs the spatial data in order to be consistent in our management approach. And then finally, I mean, just any new effort that we're starting, we can go to a place and mine the existing data, and we're not having to start from scratch. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm shorter than Raul if you didn't figure that out. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is going to be Carolyn Sweat, who's the field supervisor for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And as she's coming up, I'd like to specifically thank her. As you may or may not realize, this project has been going for several years. It's taken a lot of endurance for folks to keep with it for this long. And in particular, the seeds strategy section work that Sarah Culpa so capably shared with us this morning has been one that's really taken a lot of deep diving and thinking about the trade-offs that are necessary for us to make plant materials decisions on the landscape. And Carolyn was very, very helpful in allowing Sarah to continue that work, and I do really appreciate it. I think that's a chapter that's going to have particular utility for the sagebrush ecosystem, and I appreciate your wisdom on that. Thank you.
We're of much more similar height, Karen, so I don't have to move this mic much. Thank you for that. I am Carolyn Sweat. I'm the field supervisor, as Karen said, with the Reno Fish and Wildlife Office. I am beginning my 15th year as a servant with the Fish and Wildlife Service, 7th year here in Nevada, and 2nd year as the field supervisor here in Reno. And I really do appreciate the opportunity to come and speak on behalf of what this represents, not just to the Reno Fish and Wildlife Office, but the Fish and Wildlife Service as a whole. Very grateful to see the products that are coming together under this science framework and eager to convey what I think it represents to our agency across the 11 western states that are working on behalf of sagebrush ecosystem conservation. As many of you may know, but for those who don't, the mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service is working with others to conserve fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. The Endangered Species Act, which is one of the many forces that brought us to where we are today, aspires to the purpose of conserving imperiled species and the ecosystems upon which they depend. A great many of the species that are listed and are being evaluated for listing under the Endangered Species Act, Karen alluded to some in her introductory remarks, that the opportunity to affect meaningful conservation at the ecosystem scale is a real challenge. And many of our activities under that statute and with those species is all too often to the frustration of the service as well as the many partners with which we work. The conversations tend to be focused on the species itself. What's compelling to us as a Bureau and employees, and I know to all of us that are here about this effort and what it represents, is that we truly have and are engaged in an opportunity to conserve the ecosystems upon which sage grouse and the many other species associated and dependent upon this ecosystem depend. Karen and the others asked us to speak to some of the circumstances that brought us here, and I feel, it's my responsibility, and I think it's important for me to remind us all, at least as far as the Fish and Wildlife Service's role in the Endangered Species Act, just briefly overview some of that history. From 1999 to 2005, the service received 8 separate petitions to list greater sage grouse under the Endangered Species Act. In 2010, we found that sage grouse, as many others have alluded, warranted protection, but we determined that listing was precluded by higher priority listing actions, gave us some time in which to work, and that finding was based upon continued population declines with some areas of local extirpation resulting from habitat fragmentation. In that same year, in 2010, we acknowledged that habitat fragmentation for sage grouse was caused by a number of land use activities, specifically energy development, ag conversion, conifer encroachment, wildfire, and invasive species, all of the threats that you've been hearing about here today. In 2011, the following year, we submitted a national listing work plan in a consolidated court case with many petitioners agreeing to several deadlines to move species that were recognized as candidates for listing out of candidate status. One of those was sage grouse, and we committed in the court settlement to render a decision in 2015 as to whether or not sage grouse truly warranted listing. In our September 30th, 2015 finding, we were quite happy to be able to conclude that sage grouse, in fact, did not warrant listing as a result of the combined federal, state, private, academic efforts to pull together a comprehensive conservation strategy, much of which you've been hearing about the successes of those efforts here today. How is that changing the Fish and Wildlife Service? The sagebrush ecosystem, as you've heard, is one of the largest, if not the largest, contiguous ecosystem in the United States. The opportunity to conserve this ecosystem, not just sage grouse, but the many species that it is associated with, represents a truly transformative conservation model for the Fish and Wildlife Service and all of our partners, thus precluding, we hope, not just the need to list sage grouse, but the countless other species that are associated with this system. If we get this right, the stakes are tremendously high. The gains are huge. As a result of that, the Fish and Wildlife Service is reorganizing itself as a bureau across the 11 western states and 3 fish and wildlife regions. We have an operations plan that guides how we work, not just within the Endangered Species Program staff that are responsible for the decisions about protections under the Endangered Species Act, but with our private lands program, the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, our refuge system. Integrating those staff, facilitating knowledge transfer so that we too, as a bureau, are capable of knowing the concepts that are encapsulated within the science framework and able to deploy them with our partners and with all of you on the ground. Many within our agency, certainly with changes in administration, have asked good questions about, with the 2015 finding, do we need to sustain this effort in the service? Can we not look to our partners? I'm happy to say that our regional directors and our incoming acting director are resolute that this is truly a transformative moment in conservation for the Endangered Species Act, and they have, through the course of those conversations, reached agreement that we need to sustain our current levels of commitment at least through 2020. We need time to see this through. The science framework, as you have heard and has been said by many others better than I can, is a truly unprecedented effort to coalesce the best available science on the ecological processes that we're trying to manage, the risks and uncertainties that surround those processes, the goals and objectives that we're trying to achieve, and render that science decipherable to the layperson out on the ground. That is how we make effective conservation happen and continue to uphold the expectations and the hopes that the service had in 2015 about why listing of this bird is not needed at this time. So this is truly a toolkit for exactly that. As for how we are using the framework, I think we're using it in many similar ways as you've heard other speakers refer to, recognizing that the Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for, the direct management of but a fraction of the landscape that we're talking about. Our role really, more often than not, is in working with each of you and private as well as federal and state landowners across this vast landscape to ensure that those entities are aware of products like the science framework, understand the rigor in the underlying science concepts that it contains, and find it useful and are able to deploy it in the ways that my co-panelists are describing to get real work done on the ground. With that, in closing, I'll just reiterate the messages that my co-panelists are articulating, but from the perspective of the Fish and Wildlife Service, we are so excited to see products like this science framework really coming into fruition. We think that they represent unprecedented examples of collaboration and integration of the best available science with an effort to get it communicated in a way that line officers out on the ground can understand. We're hopeful that they're going to result in us truly recognizing the many legitimate trade-offs that we face in this ecosystem conservation challenge so that we can direct the precious few resources that we have to the most important conservation actions on the ground. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak. I'm not sure if I have time for any questions. Okay, thank you.
Carolyn, thank you very much for that. Some great comments. Our next speaker is going to be Bill Dunkelberger. He is let me get this right since I butchered it before, forest supervisor here at Humboldt-Toyabe. He started his career with the Bureau of Land Management, and he's really performed in a lot of collaborative types of positions. He served as the Service First Coordinator for the Department of Interior for a while and is currently on the Great Basin LCC Steering Committee. So I welcome your time today. Thank you, Bill.
I'm a little bit taller than Carolyn. Well, good afternoon. It's nice to see everybody here. I was talking to Thad in the hall before about the science framework, and I was saying I had to go look it up when Jane sent me her email. Not that I wasn't familiar with it, but just to make sure we could address how we're using the concepts or not, and what we used to do. I've been involved more or less in restoration since only about 2002. I was the BLM manager down in Bishop, California back then. Prior to that, most of my career has been in recreation and managing large mobs of people in national recreation areas and stuff like that. So I would say since 2002, we have been using one form of the science framework or another, probably the precursor to it. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about what we're doing on the Humboldt-Toyabe and talk about how we're basically implementing in using the resistance and resilience concepts in 3 different examples. If you're not familiar with our forest, we're the largest forest in the lower 48, 6.3 million acres, which is about the size of one of the BLM's districts here in Nevada, but we're pretty big for a national forest. And we have the most sagebrush habitat of any national forest, about half of our forest, so 3 million acres. The 3 examples I'm going to talk about are the bi-state sage-grouse conservation planning tool. Then I'm going to talk about a fire reseeding effort that we recently pulled off, and Brad Hatch, right here on my staff, was very integrally involved in that. And then I want to just talk a little bit about how we're using targeted grazing and kind of some adaptive management along with that. The bi-state conservation effort, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, has been going on since the early 2000s. It's actually a very dynamic partnership, and Carolyn didn't mention, she mentioned the greater sage-grouse finding, but through the efforts of the bi-state sage-grouse local area working group, technical advisory team, and executive oversight committee, we were able to come up with a conservation action plan that basically identified what needed to be done, how much it would cost, and we were actually able to secure financial commitments to get it done over the next 10 years. And so that influenced the service quite heavily to find that the bi-state bird was also not warranted for listing. But thanks to the USGS, primarily Dr. Pete Coates, who I think a lot of you know, he developed a conservation planning tool that we used to come up with this action plan and to prioritize where we get the best bang for the buck. So we still use that. It's been refined over the years, and it's just an example of a great tool that helps us kind of plan from the large landscape scale. Of course, once we do that, we have to, get out on the ground and fine-tune things at the local level. And actually, I'm proud to say that amongst the partners, which include the BLM, NRCS, Forest Service, both NDOW and California Fish and Wildlife, and a whole bunch of private landowners, we've achieved, I think, about 50% of our conservation action plan just in the last 3 years. So that's very impressive. I think I skipped a slide here. Hang on. Oh, here we go. We had a fire up in the Santa Rosa Mountains in northeastern Nevada this past summer, burned about 4,000 acres of priority sage-grouse habitat. So we were quite concerned about doing some restoration, trying to get on that quickly. We actually were able to pull off some funding with contributions from NDOW to do some aerial seeding up there just, about a couple months ago, Boyd? And the timing was perfect. We had snow on the ground, and then we got a little bit of snow on top of that after we did the seeding. But instead of just buying some seed and getting it out there, we tried to think about it a little bit and use the resistance and resilience concepts and science framework. And instead of targeting the higher elevation areas where we think the recovery should be pretty good, we actually targeted some of the lower elevation, more at risk for cheatgrass invasion areas. But we used a seed mix that included some non-natives, crested wheatgrass, and sunflower, which is not normally used at fire rehab, kind of as an experiment. And we're partnering with the Rocky Mountain Research Station to actually set up some study plots, and we're going to monitor the effectiveness of not only the seeding, but also, the effectiveness in preventing cheatgrass introduction in the area. So that was another example of how we're using best science. And then we've actually been using targeted grazing for quite some time on the HT, not as much as I'd like, and we're looking at more opportunities to do that. But we actually use sheep all over the Carson Range here, actually behind Reno and Carson City. We've been actually using livestock grazers, sheep producers to target cheatgrass production, mostly in the early spring, for fuels reduction. And it's been fairly successful. We've learned some lessons. We've been conducting monitoring as well. We found out that grazing during dry seasons is much more effective than during wet seasons, for example, and so we've adjusted our thinking there. We're also currently using goats in one area on the Carson Ranger District to deal with some horrible noxious weed infestation down in Douglas County, and we're actually doing some monitoring to learn from that as well. The other thing that we recently adopted was a new policy, actually in the Intermountain region of the Forest Service, that allows grazing flexibility on either end of the season, which, as you all know, that depending on the year and the moisture and the forage production and fuel out there, there's usually a need to adjust grazing seasons, and it's also a tool that we hope to be able to use for targeted grazing for things like cheatgrass removal and for fuels reduction. So to sum up, I think we've been using the science framework in one way or another for many years, and we're fortunate to have a great partnership with our other sister agencies, folks like Gene Chambers from Rocky Mountain Research Station that actually I try to get Gene to meet with my management team once a year or so, and we provide input on tools that we think would be useful for management, for science to look into. And so I think we're on the right track. I think with our limited funding and declining budgets, we need to use these tools more than ever and really prioritize where we do our work out there. So with that, if I have time for questions, okay. I guess I do. Any questions? Karen?
If you don't mind, I'll ask one. I'm interested in your comments on training needs, and I'm wondering what you think could be done to help people understand and use the science framework.
Excuse me. Yeah, her question was, she wanted to know what I thought about training needs in helping people to understand how to use the science framework. I think there is a big need, and especially for managers like me who don't actually come from a totally scientific background. I know that I've had to educate myself, and I think that I've got similar district rangers and staff officers that could benefit from more formal training. But I like the way our researchers are headed, and I'll use Pete Coates as an example, and the conservation planning tool in the bi-state. Even though he could talk about it, at a level that none of us in here could understand, he does have the ability to kind of scale it down to fifth grade English for folks like me. And so I think it's really critical that we make sure that our researchers understand that, that's a critical need as well. Sure.
So our last panelist today will be San Stiver with the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. San's been working with Wafaa for about 15 years, directly with Wafaa, starting out as a sage grouse coordinator and moving into sagebrush coordinator. Wafaa in particular, it was a Wafaa Fire and Invasives Working Group that pulled together the first general technical reference that we've been talking about, the one for the Great Basin, the 326, and also will be carrying forward some of the work from the science framework. So I'm really glad that San was able to be here today and can end this panel discussion before we go into Q&A. San, thank you.
Thank you, Karen. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk about the science framework, but more generally our efforts of collaboration and work that we have accomplished over the past 10 or 15 years. Just a little background on me. I was a sage grouse manager in Nevada for 25 years, worked 30 years for Nevada, and worked 15 now for Wafaa, again on sage grouse. First counted my first sage grouse in 1971, and that lek is still active, which is pretty cool. I've got a long personal history and family history in the sagebrush ecosystem, and it's really good to see stuff coming together. Our family had a ranch in Gunnison in 1878. I'm sure they shot the hell out of sage grouse. because that would be food. And I think my earliest family connections to sagebrush and sage-grouse would have been in 1856 in central Utah. So anyway, it's kind of personal to me to do this, and the last 15 years have really been pretty spectacular in terms of having folks come together through crisis or by crisis to accomplish things. So just a guidepost on what should be a relatively quick talk. I'm glad Hannah left. Oh, here she comes. So I don't get flagged. But I'd like to give you some background on who Wafaa is. How do we do business in the past? How's our business model changed through this? And how are we going to integrate the science framework into our program? So who is Wafaa? We're the oldest regional fish and wildlife agency association in the U.S. We started in 1922, and our objective in 1922 was to make sure the feds stayed out of our business. At that particular time, after we'd gotten through the teens, federal agencies, particularly the Forest Service, were wanting to usurp all the states' management authority, and the states were kind of against that. So this really formed the beginning of our association. We have 23 state and provincial and territorial members. The jurisdiction of our members extends for over half of North America. And the mission statement for the association is advancing conservation through information exchange and working partnerships. We work on a committee basis within Wafaa, and our state agencies, you know, are independent, and they obviously have different models depending on their state and the configurations of their particular political constraints. So how do we do business in the past? Wafaa and our state members and federal members have focused in 3 distinct avenues for science and management efforts in the past. And early on, members recognized the need for science. And Ding Darling in 1932 saw that need, but he also saw that Fish and Game agencies, he was with Iowa Fish and Game Commission, saw that they didn't have the resources or the ability to be able to actually have a research section. You know, they had a couple of game wardens, kind of a deal. So he brokered a deal between, I think, Iowa State College and the Iowa Fish and Game Commission to begin to do research. And that model started, I think, in 1933 and quickly became an idea of his. He went to work for the federal government, and they began the cooperative fish and wildlife units that were based with land grant colleges, with state members, and continued from there. Very important part of the research efforts that we identified in those days. And you've got lots and lots of co-op units I'm sure everybody's familiar with. Additionally, some of the states felt perhaps that they could augment that, or maybe weren't served as well as they thought. They developed their own research units, which typically address management considerations for the states through research by a state-driven operation. Wafaa in the past and currently synthesizes information. Our idea is to move information both horizontally and vertically. And we've been very successful working through committee systems with, like, a committee that I chair or vice chair of is the Western Bird Conservation Committee. The Sage-Grouse Technical Committee is one of our subcommittees, and they generate or synthesize white papers or the infamous Conley guidelines of 2000. And we've been successful going through those particular methods for getting information out. So how's our business model changed? So we really recognize the need to have expanded efforts to bring together groups of people. And we developed and increased our engagement and facilitation of science products. And the first thing we did was 2013, I suppose. We came up with the invasive and fire working group. Ken Mayer chaired that. And he called me up and he says, who do we need on this group? And I gave him about 10 people. And he came up with 3 or 4 more, 5 more, and he made like 15 phone calls, asked people if they'd like to be part of this group. He was 15 for 15 with people saying, holy crap, yes, we want to do this. We really want to be involved in it. We also, the next year, started the Sagebrush Science Initiative with Dr. Tom Remington leading that as part of our overall sage-grouse/sagebrush initiative. And those efforts have been funded by the BLM, primarily by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and with some input from us. And we typically send out RFPs for different points of interest and then select folks to do work for us. In 2014, Wafaa implemented a different thing. It was the Lesser Prairie Chicken range-wide plan. And that's our first really dipping into conservation management on the ground. That's about a $65 million project now, mostly mitigation, but we do a lot of monitoring of the effectiveness of conservation actions on lesser prairie chickens. And we continue to work with our partners to distribute the outputs of our collective work. So how are we going to integrate the science framework into our program? Wafaa and our collaborators are developing Sagebrush Conservation Plan or strategy. This strategy will be much like our sage grouse conservation strategy completed in 2006, which really outlined where we're going to go. Our first phase of that is to do an assessment of the science, and the science framework is a major underpinning of that particular assessment and how we'll work forward with the sagebrush strategy. The second phase of it, as we envision it, is beginning to incorporate the economics and cultural aspects. I like to say that we have 3 groups of people, and those are sagebrush obligate humans, sagebrush dependent humans, and sagebrush associated humans. And we think that we need to engage those folks, and with the technology that we have currently, we think we can actually involve those folks in the implementation and management of conservation actions. The framework will also form a significant component of future publications that we develop and that our partners develop. So with that, I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you. Collaboration has been the key. We never would have thought we could have gotten this entire group of folks together to do what we've done, and I think it leads us to a really bright future in implementing conservation actions that are far-reaching. The taskmaster says 1 question.
Sam, do you want to talk about how people can become involved with the conservation strategy? Is there an opportunity that you're envisioning for that?
Yes, but it's going to be, so we have some technical teams that we're putting together to write sections. And that product will come out and mostly be a peer-reviewed kind of a document. I think the big place where people can become involved is as we get into the socioeconomic aspect of how do we implement this thing with the folks that are here.
So thank you all very much. I really appreciated the comments. One of the concerns I think everybody always has is there's a lot of energy that goes into creating documents and products, and then there's always the potential that they can sit on the shelf and just grow stale. So it's really exciting to hear that that's not going to happen to this effort. There's so much energy around it that all of us have put into it that there's a real opportunity to keep it going forward. We have about 10 minutes for discussion with all of the panelists, and so I'd like to just open it up at first and see if there are any questions from the floor. I'm hoping, Dave. And I'll restate the question for the audience.
I'd like to address the panel because we've got 2 people from the Department of Interior, 2 people from the Department of Agriculture, and a representative from the state. We've had a change in administration that has occurred prior to when we began the work on this to now. What sorts of information have you gotten at this stage to indicate commitment from the various departments and states to continue on with the process?
All right, so I'm going to begin by restating that. Our speaker, Dave Pike, pointed out that we have a panel that's made up of representatives from the Department of Interior, the Department of Agriculture, State Fish and Wildlife, and asked, given the change in administration, what commitment we've seen to continuing on. Did I get that correct? All right. Who would like to start?
Okay, BLM, Department of the Interior. So the President's priorities, which tie down to the Secretary's priorities when it comes to what we're talking about here, habitat restoration as it relates to ecosystem health is still a high priority for this administration. In spite of what we hear a lot about the energy dominance and energy independence, which definitely is a big priority for the administration, they're still, very concerned, and a lot of folks back on the Hill are really want to continue with the effort that we've been going over the past few years to do good things with the sagebrush ecosystem at the end of the day. I know they're having conversations about the wild horse and burrow program and what do we need to do there, because I think people recognize the impacts, that being over AML as much as we are going to have on our ability to be successful in restoration. I'm hearing a lot of people are supportive of the non-listing decision in 2015 by Fish and Wildlife Service for sage grouse. And even though we're about to do a plan amendment, everyone's got their eye on the ball. They don't want to lose that determination by Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's kind of like tweaking the plan. But at least from our perspective, what we're hearing is the goal is still to do good things on the landscape to improve the restoration of the landscape. And fire and fuels is another area that's definitely getting a lot of attention. And obviously with this past summer's fire, folks are definitely looking at what tools we can use, either grazing tools, other tools to help reduce fuels on the landscape so that we can minimize potentially catastrophic fires and start to, try to push back on the invasive encroachment in the Great Basin.
Ladies first.
How gracious, ladies first. Okay, all right, this is interior first. I would echo, so again, Fish and Wildlife Service, I would echo a lot of Raul's messages. As many folks are aware, relatively early in his tenure, Secretary Zinke issued a secretarial order that, invited an opportunity to examine the sage grouse plan amendments and a broader dialogue with the states and others about what was stood up there and what needed to change. Because clearly there were some, stakeholders who felt that either their voices weren't heard or that, aspects of that maybe weren't exactly what they wanted to see. I think that we, certainly within the Fish and Wildlife Service, were very encouraged by the feedback that emerged from that secretarial order through the Western Governors Association and the Sage Grouse Task Force and others that, as Raul alluded to, it was clear that while there was an acknowledgement that we should at least talk about what might need to be adjusted, the foundational principle of trying to avoid a listing and the legitimacy of addressing the threats to this ecosystem, continued to ring true in a lot of that, conversation. Furthermore, I think, I recognize the work that Wafaa did and our respective state directors as early on in that conversation, some of the narrative started to shift, frankly, away from habitat and toward bird population numbers. And can't we, solve this through maybe a greater emphasis on captive rearing and translocations? And it was not just, although, some of the most helpful responses came up through Wafaa and our state wildlife directors and agencies. It was also a great many other constituents, even the landowners and ranching community as well, that weighed in and acknowledged, no, we have a legitimate habitat problem to address. And so I think, although we certainly have uncertainty about, where some of the plan revisions will go, we're encouraged, in, those conversations that there's clarity around avoiding a listing and retaining focus on habitat, and that through that, a great deal of what the momentum that's started will continue.
Forest Service, which is Department of Agriculture. So our secretary is Sonny Perdue, and he actually was the governor of Georgia and is a farmer. And actually very interested in what the Forest Service does, but I think his concept was we cut trees and that's about it. Because, in Georgia, a lot of timber production. So he's slowly learning all the things that we do. And I'm very enthusiastic that actually he's indicated a desire to come out west this spring and do a tour. We're trying to get him to come out to the Humboldt-Toyabe, at least for a day. But from our Washington office, so there's a lot of education going on all the things that we do besides cut timber. And we're seeing the, continuing support for funding levels similar to last year, which is good. And then I'm sensing a lot of congressional support. I met with our Congressman Amadei, not too long ago. He's very supportive of continuing funding for restoration for sagebrush ecosystem conservation and restoration. So I think, we just need to do our job and educate folks and let them know that this is a really critical initiative that has a lot of momentum that we don't want to lose.
Thank you. I'm also with USDA, with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. One of the things I would like to say from our end, from the administration, is it's been stressed, work locally, work with partners, strengthen local communities, and those key aspects. And I think as this group, we're doing that, and as our agency through SGI and our other conservation efforts within the Natural Resources Conservation Service, we're making that happen. And so I think we're fitting into what the administration would like, but it's not a change from what we've been doing in the past. It's continuing to do that. We've also congressionally have heard, responses from the Senate and the House Ag Committee, because our funding comes through the Farm Bill that's reauthorized every 5 years. And the conservation work that NRCS has been doing on the landscape has been very well received by a whole host of partners, from the cattlemen's to, the NGOs and, American Bird Conservancy and TNCs and, a whole host of spectrum of partners and everything. So it's been very positive that way. But and the Farm Bill is supporting it from what we've seen in the original drafts that have been, circulated by both the House and the Senate so far. So I think, overall we've got support. I think there's going to be some changes and efficiencies on how we do things, because that's been made public, as agencies within USDA, that we're all going to, work to streamline things to be more efficient and do more in an efficient manner and everything. So I think overall, we will, be continuing to do what we're doing and making a difference on the landscape with our partners. So with that, I'll turn to Sam.
Thanks, Thad. Trying to read the tea leaves is a little bit difficult. But in October, I went back for a visit on the Hill, and we visited with a number of congressionals, both on the Senate side and on the House side, both Republicans and Democrats. And with the exception of one staffer who really didn't know what a sage-grouse was or anything about the issue, everybody else was very familiar with the commitment to sage-grouse conservation and to the need to continue our efforts. So that from the congressionals was really, really good to hear. We visited with some appropriators, and apparently there's a mystery person that tells them how much they can appropriate, but the appropriators were all pretty gung-ho on continuing funding on the sage-grouse conservation effort. I'm not sure if the number's going to be current or if it's going to be down, but things like the science framework will really help us prioritize where to put that money. And frankly, we're putting a lot of money out on the ground. I'm estimating by 2020 we'll spend $1.5 billion in the sagebrush ecosystem. So we've got a huge machine rolling, and the folks are pretty focused on doing good things. We also met with the OMB at the White House, and they're fully aware of sage-grouse and sagebrush conservation and continuing the effort, and actually the commitment to maintain and continue the effort. So we may not get as much money, but I think we're still going to get as much money as they can give us, and I think that that the commitment from the political folks is there. And we can't really underestimate the impact and input from our governors. in the West. Generally, the state governors are well aware of what's going on. They're vocal. They don't hesitate writing letters to the secretary saying that they're not pleased with something that's gone one way or another way, but they talk back and forth, and both groups have sage grouse and sagebrush conservation in their DNA and their forefront thoughts. We're going to lose a couple of them this year through election processes, but I think that the transition between Friedenthal and Meade was seamless, in terms of a sage grouse effort, and I think we'll see that again with our next governors. I think the Sandoval and Kenny Gwynn operation in Nevada was seamless. Both governors are very, very aware of sage grouse needs. So I'm pretty optimistic. I think the last 10 or 15 years of my career are going to be good.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the panel. If we could give them a quick round of applause.